All right, guys, so this is big and very bad news. Two Russian warships have approached Cuba ahead of military exercises in the Caribbean. So, as you all know, the Ukraine and Russia war is raging on. There's been a lot of stories in the news recently about Ukraine is just conscripting more and more and more. Russia did some conscription thing too. A lot of people fled Russia. A lot of people fled Ukraine. But they're conscripting more and more, and they got guys who are really old. They have people with mental disabilities that Ukraine is now bringing into their military. Of course, every few months we hear, oh my God, they can't hold out any longer. They need billions of dollars more worth of weapons. And look, at some point, it doesn't matter how many weapons you give. If you don't have the people you need to win the war, how the fuck are you going to win the war, right? So it's a rough situation. There was a minute there where it looked like Ukraine was crushing Russia, and then as the war dragged on, it became a war of attrition, and suddenly the fact that you have a bigger military and more money becomes a massive, massive advantage, and now the general consensus is really Ukraine's only holding them off. At some point, Russia's going to effectively win the war, whatever that looks like, right? But now you have Russia sending their ships to right by our doorstep, right in the Caribbean. And why are they doing that? Well, let's dive in and we'll discuss it. So, a fleet of Russian warships on Wednesday began entering the Caribbean in what some see as a projection of strength as tensions grow over Western support for Ukraine. The first two ships slowly crossed the mouth of the Havana Bay under a downpour. The ships were accompanied by small boats that guided them through the narrow entrance channel. The U.S. military expects the exercises will involve a handful of Russian ships and support vessels, which may also stop in Venezuela. Russia is a longtime ally of Venezuela and Cuba, and its warships and aircraft have periodically made forays into the Caribbean. But this mission comes less than 2 weeks after President Joe Biden authorized Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons to strike inside Russia to protect Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, prompting President Vladimir Putin to suggest his military could respond with asymmetrical steps elsewhere in the world. So let's talk about this for a second. At the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, you'll remember the U.S. was, while they were helping Ukraine, there was a tone of caution coming from Biden, coming from his administration. You know, the idea was, how do we do a tit for tat without escalating, without doing something that Putin can view as an escalation, right? This was the conversation. So, for example, Ukraine got a lot of weapons, but certain weapons were held back from them. Certain long-range weapons, for example, they're like, we're not going to give you that because if you use that, you're going to shoot into Russia. That's going to be an escalation. Who knows what they will do in response? This effectively, it's a proxy war that we're in, which makes us somewhat responsible. We don't want to escalate. We don't want war, but we want to give you the ability to defend yourself, right? So there were all these rules around, sure, they can have weapons, but they can only have defensive weapons. They can have some small arms, but they can't have fighter jets. They can't have these long-range weapons. And slowly but surely over time, those rules that were built up were peeled away one by one. Okay, we said you couldn't have that kind of weapon, but, you're doing kind of rough, so here, you could have that kind of weapon. Sure, we said no long-range missiles, but you're kind of in trouble here. Here's some long-range missiles, right? And what we've seen here is the definition of what's called mission creep. And there were articles the other week that said the U.S. effectively gave the green light, a little wink and a nod, where they were like, okay, if you want to attack inside Russia, you're defending yourself, so go ahead. But again, we are now partly responsible for that because we are providing the weapons that are used in order to do that, right? So it's bad because mission creep is a terrifying thing. Who knows where it ends, right? You have this tit for tat and you have people going one step further, then one step further, then one step further. At some point, there is no further to go. So this really is echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis because that's where Russia is moving these ships to. Most of all, the warships they continue are a reminder to Washington that it is unpleasant when an adversary meddles in your near abroad, said Benjamin Gedden, director of the Latin America program in the Washington-based Wilson Center think tank, referring to Western involvement in Russia's war in Ukraine. It also reminds Russia's friends in the region, including U.S. antagonists Cuba and Venezuela, that Moscow is on their side. Although the fleet includes a nuclear-powered submarine, a senior U.S. administration official told the Associated Press that the intelligence community has determined no vessel is carrying nuclear weapons. The official, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to provide details that had not been announced publicly, said Russia's deployments pose no direct threat to the United States. U.S. officials last week said the Russian ships were expected to remain in the region through the summer. It's actually interesting to me that the tone of the U.S. government and the tone of the media is trying to downplay Russia doing this. Honestly, I view that as more of a good sign. If they were really doing the routine where it's like, oh my God, this is a threat. Oh my God, they could attack any minute. Oh my God, the U.S. president must act. That would put pressure on Biden to then in return escalate even further. So I don't know why they're taking this more moderate, neutral tone, but it's better that we're getting that than we're getting the hair on fire stuff, which could have dire consequences, right? Remember, people don't realize how close we got to total annihilation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is not something I want to relive, you know? Not that I was alive at the time, but you get the point. Russian ships have occasionally docked in Havana since 2008 when a group of... Stinky, stop pressing the table. Be a good girl. Be a good girl, Stinky. Be a good girl. Be a good girl. Where was I? Russian ships have occasionally docked in Havana since 2008 when a group of Russian vessels entered Cuban waters in what state media described as the first such visit in almost 2 decades. In 2015, a reconnaissance and communication ship arrived unannounced in Havana a day before the start of discussions between U.S. and Cuban officials on the reopening of diplomatic relations. The good old days of 2015 when Obama every now and then would do something good like the Iran nuclear deal or normalizing with Cuba. Those days are long gone, bro. Long gone. A State Department spokesperson told the AP that Russia's port calls in Cuba are routine naval visits, while acknowledging its military exercises have ratcheted up because of U.S. support to Ukraine and exercise activity in support of our NATO allies. So look, again, it's just a proxy war at this point. And everybody knows it. It's just a proxy war. You got to start looking for an off-ramp. You got to start looking for an end to the death and the destruction and the carnage and the escalation and the firing back and forth. And you got to stop. We're either going to end it now in some sort of diplomatic fashion, or we're going to end it in 2 or 3 years in a diplomatic fashion, or it's going to spiral out of control and we're going to have World War III. I mean, there's only certain ways it can end, right? There's only certain ways it can end. Why not do the thing that leads to the least amount of death and destruction and the least amount of putting us in danger? Yeah, I don't know. This seems like kind of a big deal. This seems like kind of a big deal to me. And since we've seen the mission creep in the U.S., and by the way, I should make this point. The notion shouldn't even enter your mind that, oh, these are serious people and they'll find a way. Because what's going on in Israel and Gaza should totally disabuse you of that notion. The idea, oh, these are adults. These are serious people. They'll figure it out. You know, it'll end in a positive way. It always does. Like that. Don't think that way. Because it's not true. What Israel should prove to you is that we are led by complete and utter dead-eyed psychopaths. Straight up. And they're just responding to lobbyist money and donor money and institutional pressure and media garbage. And it's just the perfect stew of complete and utter idiocy and callous disregard for life. So all the decisions vis-a-vis Ukraine, and by the way, for the record, I understand backing Ukraine is a much more noble thing. They were illegally invaded by Russia. Backing them is a much more noble thing than backing Israel. In fact, it would be more analogous to supporting Ukraine and the Palestinians, right? But having said that, don't get it twisted. These motherfuckers are the same dumbasses who are doing everything wrong in Israel, and that should make you look extra skeptically at the decisions they're making here as well. So it turns out, given the green light to Ukraine to use our weapons to attack in Russia, that has consequences, man. That has consequences. And I don't think these people have thought this stuff through in any way, shape, or form. And that should terrify you. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop. And watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.